Okay, I think I can get started now. For those of you who haven't met or seen me before, my name is Mary Redfern and I'm the curator of the East Asian collections here at the Chester Beatty. I also had the great fortune to be curator for our current exhibition, Edo in Colour, Prints from Japan's Metropolis. And we're now very much in not even the final weeks, but the final days of this exhibition, which has been open since May, and the exhibition will close on the 5th of December. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, please do make your way down to the Chester Beatty and you can see it on site. But if you can't get down to us in Dublin, you can also see the exhibition online. Just go to our website and find the exhibition page and you can explore it all in 3D. In this last moment of the exhibition, we wanted to organise a couple of talks related to two of Edo's most famous artists. And given that both of them were artists in the late Edo period and their work comes in towards the end of the exhibition itself, it seemed a fitting subject to do our last two lectures on the artists Hiroshige and Hokusai. So today I'm going to be talking about Hiroshige, and next week in the same time, the same place, my wonderful colleague, Dr. Ryoko Matsuba of the Sainsbury Institute of the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures will be giving a fresh perspective on that most celebrated of series, Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji. So do be sure to find details of her talk and register through our What's On pages. But for today, we're going to be taking a look at Hiroshige. So today I'm taking my lead from this gorgeous print in the exhibition of an eagle sighting its prey far above the Edo coast. And I'll be focusing on the snowscapes designed by Utagawa Hiroshige. Hiroshige is one of Edo's leading artists in the landscape print genre, and today can be counted among Japan's best known artists internationally as well. In fact, should you ever find yourself testing your knowledge in the picture round of a quiz show and a Japanese landscape print comes up, typically it's only ever a landscape print, the answer will invariably be either Hokusai or Hiroshige. So hopefully some of what you see today might help, but please don't chase me if you get it wrong. Hiroshige was born in 1797 and died in 1858, so he's an artist of the later part of Japan's Edo period, which went from around 1603 to 1858. In his career, it's estimated that Hiroshige designed between 4,000 and 4,500 prints, as well as creating illustrations for more than 120 printed books. The Chester Beatty collection includes 69 prints by Hiroshige. Even in this relatively small grouping, we can quickly see that his work extended far beyond the landscape genre. Another significant genre in which Hiroshige worked was the elegant prints of birds and flowers known as kachoga, a genre that, like landscape, was especially popular during Edo's late period. Hiroshige also produced images of actors and beauties, both in and out of landscape contexts. And on rare occasion, he even produced Suramono prints, one of the highlights of the Chester Beatty collection, these privately published prints that were created at the request of Edo's poetry clubs. Moving beyond the Chester Beatty collection to complete the picture, we need to add printed books. Most of the printed books that Hiroshige worked on were explorations of landscape and travel that fitted very well alongside his single sheet prints. But he's also been attributed a number of volumes of shunga, the explicit erotic prints of Edo period Japan. And that includes this work here on the left, which is called Edo Nishiki Azuma Bunko. And this was only recently attributed to Hiroshige. Previously, it had been thought it was designed by Kuniyoshi. And here we have two lovers warmly wrapped against cold weather. And this is actually very much one of the tamer images in the book. So if you want to see more, do take a look at the Pulverers website where they have the whole thing digitized. The other area in which Hiroshige produced some really exquisite designs is fan prints. Printed fans were made and sold in huge numbers during the Edo period and helped take the edge of the hot, sultry summers. And there are a few lovely Hiroshige fan prints in the Chester Beatty collection, but I wanted to include this one here, which is a gorgeous aizuri-e, or blue-printed image of the Roben waterfall. And this is in the V&A collections, and actually it's one of the first Hiroshige prints I had the good fortune of working with. And it's stayed with me ever since. I think it also provides a very nice counterpoint in blues to the snowscapes we'll be looking at today. As well as shaping a lasting image of Japan, one of the reasons that Hiroshige is so familiar to audiences internationally is the inspiration that his work provided to other artists, especially those in Europe. And these include Vincent van Gogh, who is known to have not only had a number of prints by Hiroshige in his personal collection, as here on the left, but also created 2 direct reworkings of Japanese prints in oils for his own study. And then obviously artists such as James McNeill Whistler, whose Nocturne of Battersea Bridge might well have been influenced by a view of kimedashi included in Hiroshige's 100 Famous Views of Edo, or indeed one of Hiroshige's other dramatic close-ups of bridge supports. But today is not about European art history. It would be a lot shorter if it was, because that is not my area. As is often the case with artists of the floating world, we have surprisingly little concrete information on their biographies. Though of course, in Hiroshige's case, there has been a lot of work done in this area, particularly by scholars in Japan. Hiroshige was born in Edo, the sort of de facto capital of Japan during the Edo period, as Ando Tokukaru. He grew up in a minor samurai family, so the samurai was sort of Japan's ruling class at the time, and in some ways at the top of society. And Hiroshige's father was a captain of the fire brigade assigned to Edo Castle, a role that Hiroshige in fact inherited on his father's death. But though the samurai were at the top of society officially, these weren't actually easy times in which to be a lower ranking member of the samurai class. And many samurai also did other professions, craft professions, things they could do to supplement the incomes and stipends that they had. And in Hiroshige's case, he took up art as a profession. First of all, he tried to join the studio of artist Utagawa Toyokuni, but he was turned away. He then entered into an apprenticeship with the artist Utagawa Toyohiro. And Toyohiro may be familiar to those who've seen the exhibition as the artist of the wonderful mouse story book that we have on display. And if you haven't seen that, it's definitely one of my favorites, and I've talked about it elsewhere so often I won't mention it further today, other than do take a look for Toyohiro's Fat Tales of Lucky Mice. So he started this apprenticeship with Toyohiro in 1811 and received the artist name Hiroshige just 1 year later. As well as the 69 prints by Hiroshige in the Chester Beatty collection, we actually have this one print of the artist. This is a memorial portrait to Hiroshige designed by Utagawa Kunisada. It was published at Hiroshige's death in 1858, and it's the only portrait known of the artist. The publisher of this print, Sakanaya Eikichi, was also responsible for one of Hiroshige's large print series, The 100 Views of Edo, which was actually being published exactly at this time. The artist, meanwhile, Utagawa Kunisada, also belonged to the same Utagawa school of artists that Hiroshige belonged to. And in a way, this memorial print helps cement Hiroshige's place within the Utagawa school and that legacy. Memorial portraits, or shinie, are often more associated with kabuki, the theatre, and many prints were produced after to memorialize famous actors after their passing. And we have one example of this in the exhibition, one of the earliest memorial portraits known, a beautiful portrait of the artist Yaozo. Occasionally also, we see these memorial portraits being produced of artists and musicians. And in fact, 6 years later, Kunisada himself was honored in the same way by his own pupils. But even though there aren't so many prints of artists in the memorial print genre, that's not to say that this print wasn't produced in large numbers. Impressions of this particular design can be found in a number of collections around the world, including the Chester Beatty. The body of the text gives an outline of Hiroshige's biography, which begins by stating that Hiroshige is the most distinguished pupil of Toyohiro, who was himself a pupil of Toyoharu, the founder of the Utagawa school. At present, Hiroshige, Toyokuni, actually Kunisada, and Kuniyoshi are considered the 3 greatest masters of ukiyo-e. So the biography that's presented here is very much his place within the world of art. Following this, the biography comments on his mastery of landscape, calling to attention his most recent series, 100 Views of Edo, and stating that to see this series was as if one had the landscapes before one's own eyes. There's a farewell poem by Hiroshige actually on the left of the print as well. And this poem makes it clear that whatever his other achievements, for Hiroshige himself, landscape was something that was intrinsic to his artistic career and his artistic identity. in his poem, which reads, "On the way to the east, I lay down my brush, the goal of the journey, to see the famous places of the Western paradise." And these references to east and west in this poem refer to Edo, the eastern city, Azuma, and the west is the Buddhist paradise to which he's now traveling. So he's connecting his life as an artist, working in Edo, working in this eastern land, to now traveling west to Buddhist paradise. On the right-hand side, Kunisada speaks of shedding tears in his dedication of the print. For those familiar with Hiroshige's work, our thoughts when we hear of Kunisada shedding tears and soaking his sleeve with tears are drawn to rain-soaked skies. Because Hiroshige wasn't just a master of landscape, but a master of weather, season, and the time of day. And his prints really do excel in creating these kinds of atmospheric conditions and communicating those to the viewer such that you get really immersed in the place that he's representing. Given the local audience here in Ireland, I couldn't resist doing a small roundup here of some of my favourite rainfalls depicted by Hiroshige. So moving from the left to the right, the top and then the bottom. On the top left, we have the rain that only starts to cut the sky just as you reach your destination. In this case, some travellers arriving at the station of Oisa. On the top right, we have a sudden shower sending people running, but also starting to obscure the horizon from view, something that's very familiar from my Dublin window. On the bottom left, we have a friend encouraging his companion on because they're very nearly at their destination, though the rain is heavy. And on the right, we have that most familiar of feelings where the rain is so heavy and so pervasive that you can't even lift your eyes above the horizon and just keep them tight to the ground. And all of these images, and in fact, all of the images that we have by Hiroshige in the collection can be seen in full on our online viewer. But for today, I want to talk about snow. The reason I was so glad that we were able to show the Edo in Colour exhibition in two parts is quite simple. Seasonality is really key in Japanese art. Even in scenes of indoor activities, but also obviously views of the city and landscape vistas, it's almost always possible to tell the season that is depicted in a print, whether it's through the inclusion of a certain motif, a certain flower, a certain form of dress. Communicating that seasonality is very important. And so, taking some pictures from the exhibition, we might find children hunting fireflies in the 5th month, the festival of Ebisu, a god of merchants and traders, in the 10th month, or even, as we might feel now, breaking ice upon a pond as we get to the colder time of the 11th month of the year. But of course, then we have the wonder of spring, bringing new life to the world, and an outing under cherry blossom at the famous site of Asukayama. And so in this way, you can see, even in the small selection, how Japanese prints, the prints created in the Edo period, mark the changing activities, events, and scenery of the passing year. But this is not a practice limited to the Edo period, and it's certainly not a practice limited to prints, pictorial arts, or even all the visual arts. In fact, the significance of such expression of the seasons, if it might be termed as such, has a much longer history in Japan. And its origins lie perhaps most concretely within literature. In particular, the courtly poetry of the periods around Japan's Nara and Heian periods, during which time natural and seasonal imagery really began to be codified as a way of expressing the emotions of protagonists and conveying feeling within a poem. So here we have a page from one of our beautiful manuscript books of the Tales of Issei, showing a prince and his companion toiling through snow. And the poem beside is taken from the Tales of Issei, this wonderful 10th century poem tale. And it says, "When I forget our fate, I wonder if it is not a dream, for how could I have imagined I would have to toil so far in snow to see my beloved prince?" And poems such as the poems from the Tale of Issei, poems from the Tale of Genji, would become sort of wrapped into people's cultural knowledge. So by seeing something that echoed a poem, these allusions would bring other thoughts to mind. And so we then also obviously have the Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century, was also one of the big sources for this. And these expressions that were found in Genji, that were found in other famous poems, were codified into the culture such that the inclusion of a particular bird, a particular flower, would not only bring to mind a season, but a wealth of cultural associations and even emotions. In this case, as Genji and Murasaki watch children making snowballs, the winter offers a time for reflection, and the two talk long into the night, while a pair of Mandarin ducks out on the lake that you can see there in the detail imply the depth of their bond and the hardship of any parting. But there's another aspect to the importance of seasonality in Japanese art as it was understood in the Edo period, and that had to do with the very stability and prosperity of the world itself. In Japanese tradition, the world renewed with each new year, and only by moving in step with the seasons, by properly aligning heaven and earth, could prosperity be assured. And this print here is one of a number of prints produced for the new year, when a prayer was made to the 7 lucky gods for a good, auspicious dream, the first dream of New Year. And by placing this print of the 7 lucky gods on their treasure ship under your pillow, they would hopefully bring you that lucky dream that would secure your good luck for the year ahead. And all of this multi-layered tradition was there to be inherited by Hiroshige in his art. So these Mandarin ducks under snow, which are part of an untitled series of bird and flower designs, pairing poetry and seasonal imagery, carry this motif of winter really from even the Heian period. And it was thought in classical poetry that Mandarin ducks actually slept on water so cold that frost could form on their feathers. So they were very much a symbol of winter. But for their pairing behavior, they also carried this suggestion of sincere love and fidelity that then would carry through to the human world and the world of emotion. And the poem that is written here, it's quite a short poem, but it says something along the lines of, Mandarin ducks joined by a cup, the ice thins. And my interpretation of this would be, well, the joined by a cup is referring to the marriage of the ducks. So sake cups were used very much as part of within the marriage ritual, marriage rites. So joining by a cup suggests their marriage and their pairing, while the ice thinning suggests the warmth of their affection, creating a sort of thinning the ice around them. And it's very hard to sort of stay away from the English idiom here of skating on thin ice, which is a very different direction to what this print is evoking with the warmth of the affection between these paired birds. But if we have something old in terms of seasonality, continuing the marriage theme to that, we should add something new. And that is really the success of the landscape genre in print. So Hiroshige was working from at least the 1810s in the world of print, but his breakthrough really only came in the early 1830s. So he's considered something of a late flourisher. And this breakthrough work that sort of blew everyone out of the water was a landscape series charting the coastal journey between Edo and Kyoto, the 53 post towns, the stations of the Tokaido Road, the Eastern Coastal Road. And this series was published in the 1830s. And it was around this time that Hiroshige also passed his role as a fire captain to his son, and then focused completely on his career as an artist. The series was produced very close in time to Hokusai's celebrated 36 views of Mount Fuji, as seen in this print here. And together, these two print series really established the credibility and marketability of the landscape genre in ukiyo-e. It's not to say that these were the first landscape prints, there were earlier landscape prints, definitely, but it's really in the 1830s that landscape as a genre starts to flourish. And from this point on, a whole succession of landscape series are produced. And these are long series as well, 53 prints, 36 prints, 46 prints. They're big series of prints showing these different views of landscape around Edo, around Japan. And landscape had been a focus for printed books and gazetteers. And this was part of actually a wider thing happening in society. So there's a number of factors that kind of coalesce to sort of help fuel this landscape boom in Japanese prints. And the first would be a huge growth in travel for business, pilgrimage, and recreation. So the Tokugawa shoguns, the de facto rulers of Japan, had various prohibitions and rules in place around travel across Japan. It was one of the ways they sort of kept control over the provinces. was to control the movement of people. But in this period, sort of in the early 19th century, it was starting to become a little bit easier to travel. And so there's this huge growth in travel, people going from along the main roads, also into country places, partly to visit temples, famous sites, waterfalls, but also to enjoy the scenery. And with that, given the huge publishing industry of the time, there's this huge growth in the gazetteers, the travel guides that people would buy to guide them along their way. And obviously for those who weren't able to travel, there was always the possibility of an armchair journey. But there's also a technical aspect to this. And as you can see in this gorgeous print from the 36 views, blue is a very key component. And in the 1830s, a pigment that had already been available in Japan for some time starts to become much more widely available. And that pigment is the synthetic blue, Prussian blue, sometimes in Japan called Berlin blue. This was actually imported through the Chinese and through the Dutch. It was a European developed synthetic pigment. And what Prussian blue allowed was really sophisticated gradations of tones of blue that couldn't necessarily be achieved with the blue pigments already being used by ukiyo-e printmakers. And there's a third part here as well, and that is censorship. So always when we're looking at print culture in Edo, Japan, the views of the Tokugawa shogunate, the censorship controls that are in place are there in the background. And in the case of landscape, taking a subject that might not be as controversial as subjects taken from the Yoshiwara brothel district or the theatre, let alone anything political. A less controversial choice, a choice that actually wasn't so focused on fashion that could be a long seller, was quite a good idea on the part of the publisher. So all of these factors help fuel this incredible boom in landscape prints. And Hiroshige captures landscape in a beautifully evocative way. So here you can see these gentle washes of grey just suggesting the form of the great mountains in the background against the silence of a winter sky. The small figures, as is often the case in prints from the 53 station series, don't necessarily seek to engage the viewer of the print directly, but rather turn their backs or dip their heads. So while they lend life and warmth to the scene, they're quietly going about their business rather than engaging you as the viewer. As highlighted in the exhibition, however, a number of Hiroshige's compositions from this series were actually adapted at the same time that they were being published in a series of Chuban format prints by Utagawa Kunisada, the artist who designed Hiroshige's memorial portrait. And Kunisada created an alternate realization of the 53 stations. So if you just keep this print in your mind here, the scene of Canberra, we can see it against Kunisada's adaptation. So as you can see, seeing these two side by side, Kunisada took Hiroshige's design, adopted it to the portrait format, and then paired it in the foreground with an appropriate beauty. And these two works were actually fairly synchronous. So not all of the designs in Kunisada's series were directly adapting from Hiroshige, but really the majority of them were. And the adaptation is so close, it's very visible, it's very much there in the forefront. And today this is something that would really fly against our ideas of intellectual property, but it's thought that there might be another reason as to why this was done. And it could be that this actually was part of a deal made by publishers to promote Hiroshige's work. At this time, Hiroshige was something of an untested quality. It was the 53 stations that sort of established his name. So at the early point, he was still seeking to sort of find his name and make his name. But also the landscape genre as well was only finding its feet. So Kunisada's prints almost seem to sort of bridge between the more established genres of pictures of beauties, this new genre of landscape, and possibly doing a little bit of side promotion for this new up-and-coming artist, Hiroshige. And yet any fears that publishers may have had or may not have had around Hiroshige's work were totally unfounded. The series was a huge success. Multiple states are known for several of the works in the series, and the importance of these different states, these different variant printings, is that they suggest a print that was produced over a long period of time, such that blocks were recut, edited, blocks were worn, things were done along the way, and that's then seen in the variant states. But each of these then suggests a print that is a big seller, a sort of runaway success. And in the case of the image of Canberra, the first state is defined by the lines in the knees of the figure at the right. So it's very much these tiny details that connoisseurs would be looking at when comparing different impressions of the same design. But even when you see these two images together, Kunisada's view of the pictures of women in the scenery of the 53 stations and Hiroshige's own view of Canberra, you can see really the subtlety of the gradation in Hiroshige's print. And this tonal gradation in Japanese woodblock printing is called Bokashi. And Bokashi is really used to devastating effect in Hiroshige's work. And it's part of the sort of the technique by which he builds this sense of atmosphere, this incredible immersive quality. And when you compare creating this kind of tonal gradation to printing an area of flat color, what is actually happening is a huge demand is being made on the printmaker. So in the world of Edo period woodblock printing, Hiroshige would supply the design, but specialist block cutters and printers would then execute it to make it real. So for the printer to print an image like this, he would need to moisten the block with water and tease the colorant into that water to achieve the tint and gradation required across the surface of the block. And this would need to be done for each individual print, giving a great deal of scope for variations, and also in later impressions, sometimes for cutting corners, which is another thing that you would look for when comparing different impressions of a print. And we can see sort of some of how Hiroshige would have conveyed what he wanted to the block cutter and the printer who'd be responsible for realizing his design in this marked up proof print. The text, however, is thought to have been another later hand. So in the process of printmaking, so Hiroshige, as the artist, is supplying an outline sketch, a preparatory drawing. And this was used as the basis for cutting the key block, the block that would then print the outline of the black outline of the image. Print proofs pulled from the key block, as this one would have been, were then used to mark up the colors for cutting the individual color blocks each color required. The registration marks you can see in this print would usually be trimmed off the finished, sorry, it wouldn't be trimmed. The registration marks are seen in the proof prints because these would be cut into the block. So when you're cutting the color blocks, you would include these registration marks as stops, really. So one in the bottom left, one on the lower edge, and these would help you then align the paper. So these are registration marks, and it's these that really allow the success of the layering of color in Japanese prints, because they're in the same position on every block. If you line your paper up to them correctly, the colors will print in the correct place. But looking more at the sort of the tones and the gradation in the colors applied to the proof print, we can see what Hiroshige was looking for the printer to achieve. The gentle tones really of a brushed ink wash, but capturing that painted effect in the medium of print. And we see echoes of Chinese and Japanese landscape painting traditions also in the formats Hiroshige used. And like many other print designers, Hiroshige was also very active as a painter. In this beautiful vertical diptych print of the Kiso Gorge in snow, we get a sense of the format and composition of a hanging scroll painting. The proportions, but also the way the composition is brought together, have that quality to them. But we can also make out just, in the detail of the light grey sky, fresh snow falling down in reserve onto the pines and figures below. And it's thought that this image may actually have been based on landscapes Hiroshige would have seen during his travels to Kofu province in 1842. Though the season he's thought to have travelled to that area was not winter, the snow must have then been added from his own imagination. While many of the landscapes Hiroshige depicted were landscapes that had long been honoured in poetry and in painting, indeed for centuries in some cases, as in the case of this powerful triptych of rugged snow-clad mountains, sorry, not now. Excuse me. I'll start again. So while many of the landscapes Hiroshige depicted were those that had been honoured in poetry and painting for centuries, as in the case of this powerful triptych of snow-clad mountains and ice-cold rivers on the Kiso Road, as Hiroshige recorded, he felt that his approach was fundamentally different to that of those who'd come before him, and indeed some of his peers. And that really came down to what a landscape was and how you saw it. So Hiroshige is known to have travelled through many of the landscapes that he depicted. And in the few texts that survive him, it's apparent that this was an important aspect to him within his work. During the Edo period, however, for other artists, the prevalence of gazetteers, guidebooks, and other prints meant that often it was not necessary for an artist to actually see the scene he was depicting. Furthermore, if you were to adhere to the Chinese landscape painting tradition, which was indeed so influential in Japan, the depiction of landscape was not necessarily a process of realistic representation, but rather about creating the idea of a landscape. So for those of you who might have seen our Hongling exhibition back in 2016, it was this same conception of landscape that was at play in Hongling's work, only brought into the medium of oil paint. So rather than trying to depict the landscape that you see in front of you, it's about depicting the essence of that landscape, the idea of that landscape. And that is very much the foundational principle in Chinese landscape painting. For Hiroshige, something very different was what mattered to him. In the preface to his picture book of 100 Views of Mount Fuji, perhaps also trying to distinguish his work from Hokusai's own volume on this subject, Hiroshige wrote that his illustrations were based on first-hand observation. And even though he felt it was never possible to incorporate every detail. He makes similar observations elsewhere. We have just a few little things written in these prefaces to illustrated books. So in a volume of illustrated souvenirs to Edo, he commented that he sought to accurately depict famous sites and landscapes just as one would see them with their own eyes. While in another publication, he again echoed that he would omit all those things that lacked in taste or grace. But it wasn't just about distilling what was there that mattered to him. An unpublished painting manual included the observation that paintings are based on the form of things. So if you copy the form and add style and meaning, the result is a painting. So drawing even these brief utterances together, we start to see a artistic approach developing. And for the things that were important to Hiroshige were depicting a form that was observed firsthand, the removal of any feature or detail found needless or lacking, and the addition of style and meaning. Indeed, despite his adherence to observation, such artistic license can be found often in Hiroshige's work. In this view of the daunting pass at Hakone, Hiroshige uses a vantage point that doesn't really exist. The white peak of Fuji, which you can just see there, on the left-hand side, it's just this white silhouette against the crimson sky, wouldn't be visible from this angle. And as such, we should be very cautious with Hiroshige's work. No matter how realistic it may look, his work has no intention of being topographically accurate. But when we're talking about matters of style, there's no better place to head than Edo itself. So Hiroshige's 100 Famous Views of Edo was pretty much his last major production. In fact, he died at the age of 62 in 1858, while the series was still being published. Despite the title, 100 Famous Views, the series extends to 118 prints. And each of the prints in this series exists in various states and variants. So we get luxury editions with mica and embossing, regular editions that don't have these luxury effects, but also reissues, different uses of color within the print. And all of these suggest both the value the publisher placed on it, but also the series' enduring popularity. As was sometimes the case with larger series of prints in the late Edo period, a contents page was issued at the culmination of the series, in this case posthumously for Hiroshige. The contents page here from the Brooklyn Museum shows prints grouped according to season. In the top two sections, we have the prints related to spring, which is the largest group with 42 prints. The beautiful fan in the center lists the prints of summer. On the lower right, we have autumn, and in the bottom left, we have winter, the smallest group, in fact, with 20 prints. Now, this contents page grouping all of the prints in the 100 famous views by season does not reflect their production sequence, but it shows both how readable seasons are within them and how the seasons formed really a very natural organizational structure for such bodies of work. As I said, the winter scenes account for 20 prints in the 100 famous views, and they include this striking view of Kinmyuzan Temple, Asakusa. This temple, dedicated to Kannon, is also known as Sensoji and was long established as one of Edo's meisho, or famous places. And indeed, it actually forms the subject for an earlier print that we had in the first part of the exhibition of the temple gate, which is inset here on the right. But if you compare these two prints, they're actually showing you the same gate. So we have on the left of Hiroshige's print, the single pillar and then the netting beside it. And that is exactly the same left-hand pillar that we're seeing in Tamagawa Shucho's earlier print from the 1790s. But while Tamagawa Shucho shows the gate at Asakusa, the Kaminarimon gate, as a place bustling, full of life, full of people coming to and fro, really sort of welcoming you into that space, Hiroshige presents this very same gateway as a vista of stillness. The people that you see all have their backs to you. They have umbrellas covered in light coverings of snow, and really you just get this very serene impression, while above you this huge lantern hangs in the gateway. And there's also something quite special about the palette Hiroshige uses. So in the snow scene with the red temple and the red lantern and the gate post beside you, you get this kind of vista of red and white, which would be a very good pairing when you're talking about New Year greetings as well. But it's not just the sort of the lofty, famous places of Edo that Hiroshige was interested in. So here we actually have a really striking view of Edo's lumberyards, the lumberyards at Fukagawa Kiba. And it's a really incredible composition, and you can see the lumber in the water floating, but also these huge stacks of lumber up at the side as well. And then we get the sort of the street scenes too. So here we have a canal side path leading up to the shrine at Atago. And it's these pops of colour and playful sparrows in the sky that break what would otherwise be a very somber scene of sort of whites and blues and greys. But what makes the 100 famous views of Edo so captivating to me is the number of works that take truly radical approaches to composition and perspective. And it's often where you get this inclusion of a bold element in the front of the composition. Usually, this would be known in European art history as a repoussoir, something that pushes other elements back, and it would be included either on the right or the left to bracket the picture. But Hiroshige is more than happy to put the trunk of a plum tree front and center directly in front of the viewer. In this case, that plum tree is the very famous sleeping dragon plum in the Kameido Park. And it is brought into such sharp foreground focus, while the admirers of it, you can just make out in the middle distance, sitting on benches and talking. In its most extreme case, we have the hindquarters of a horse, replete with accompanying droppings there on the floor. Now, sadly, this is not a print held in the Chester Beatty collection, but once you have seen it, as I did many years ago, the impression definitely stays with you. But even while this might seem sort of quite a childishly playful view in some ways, there's actually a very strong reason behind it that makes it quite interesting. So the location of this print, the Naito Shinjuku near Yotsuya Gate, was a semi-official center of prostitution, so definitely not on the sort of usual top Edo famous places list. And it was a much more down-to-earth prostitution district than the more purportedly refined Yoshiwara would have been. And in fact, the prostitutes within this settlement were described as the flowers that bloomed in the horse droppings of Yotsuya. So we have really quite a playful play on the reputation of the area through this very strange composition. And yet, there is such careful placement that even the subject matter didn't stop Hiroshige from really exercising extreme care in his composition, in his artistry. But in a more gentle way here, we can see those same ideas at play. So while we don't have that sort of huge dominating foreground element, we do get the edge of a folding screen here butting into the composition for almost its full length on the left-hand side. There's a human presence in the room, but it's implied rather than made concrete. Those details that can be left out are omitted. And in fact, when we look at the festival goers there in the background and the detail on the right, you can see they're only just apparent, printed in dark grey on grey, silhouettes really. And yet there is enough detail shown that we can see the tiny lucky rakes there waving, just like the lucky rake hairpins there on the green tatami floor. And then at the same time, we have the white cat sitting, watching and observing, and bringing, of course, all the style that any picture could hope for. When we look at Hiroshige's work, for my own part, his keen observation really is sort of transmitted to us, and we get almost a sense of distance in what he is observing. But through his art, Hiroshige invites us to see the world with him. And while we watch the world through his eye, the world finds incredible style, elegance, and perhaps even sometimes meaning. A grace of form that can be most exquisitely appreciated, I feel, when, as in his snowscapes, twilight scenes, and even some of his rain-saturated vistas, the palette of colours is stripped back. But it is so worth seeing these prints in person, and we really do hope that you will have a chance to see them here in the exhibition. And this one in particular has a special treat if you do see it, because we have a lovely luxury effect here, that while this eagle is soaring through the frost-soaked air, there's actually tiny flecks of glitter on his wings as the frost just starts to form. And for today, I'll finish there. Now, I would say if you have any questions, please do put those into the Q&A box. And we've got a couple there already, so that's great. So I'll get to those in a moment. But what I would also like to do is just draw your attention to the talk we will have next week. So as I mentioned at the beginning today, next week at the same time and also online, we will have a talk by Dr. Ryoko Matsuba, who is lecturer in Digital Japanese Arts and Humanities at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. And Ryoko will be talking about copying Edo landscapes, Osaka miniature versions of Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji. So do find us on the What's On page there, and you'll be able to register for that talk just as this one. So let me just make sure I've got all of these open. So we've got a couple of questions coming here. Okay, first question is about the samurai. So Hiroshige was born into the samurai class. Now, the class status system in the Edo period was very hierarchical. And the samurai were established as sort of the top rank in that system. So there were 4 official ranks: the samurai at the top, then the farmers, then the artisans, and then the merchants. And the reason for this structuring, which might seem a little curious, is that the samurai as warriors were the leaders of society. The farmers were productive. They created the crops and the rice that were essential to society. The artisans made useful things, so they could come next, while the merchants weren't seen as doing anything particularly useful at all, so they were placed at the bottom of the structure. So this was the sort of structure for the majority of society. So while Hiroshige was born into the samurai class and therefore at the top, he was a lower ranking samurai, which meant that actually his family wasn't so wealthy. And that would have been one of the things that would have encouraged him and many other low ranking samurai like him to have other work at the same time. So it's sort of, we have this quite rigid structure, but actually the individual cases as you move through it are often worth examining and exploring. So someone else has asked, So I'll just repeat this. Can I ask, is Hiroshige's work something of a reflection of societal or cultural change in Japan? And it's that his work gives a very distanced and almost voyeuristic sense of the world. And this is personally my view, so it's definitely the view I will convey whenever I talk about Hiroshige, but also Hokusai as well. I think if you look at some of the earlier prints from the Edo period, particularly the sort of prints going up to the end of the 18th century, the prints are very much forming a sense of community, inviting you to be part of that sort of bright, bustling city that is Edo. But as you move then into the 19th century, society is changing a great deal in Japan. So Edo, is no longer this young city. There are changes happening politically, there are pressures politically, there are famines, there are often famines in Japan, but again, all these things sort of factor together into giving a slightly different societal background for the art that's being created. And I think one of the things that, for me, when I definitely look at Hiroshige's work, I get a sense that you are looking at something. It's not about creating an image that is sort of inviting you to be part of this community. It's more about looking at it, observing it in the most beautiful way, but a very different form of engagement than you might get in earlier woodblock prints. So someone else has just asked if there might be a recording of this. So this talk, as with so many of our talks, will be uploaded onto our YouTube page. So it usually takes us a little while to get it processed, so please be patient and bear with us. But wherever possible, usually it's down to copyright restrictions as much as anything over the images. Wherever possible, we will share our talks online. So this one will definitely be going up to YouTube at some point. So I think the other thing I would just like to sort of say with Hiroshige is there is so much work, and I focus on his snowscapes partly because that is the area I enjoy the most. But it's very worth, looking at all these artists. Hokusai and Hiroshige, these are the big names, but within their works, there's a huge amount of diversity. But also going beyond Hokusai and Hiroshige, looking at earlier artists, their peers, and later artists as well. There is so much to Japanese prints that's worth exploring and enjoying. So some very nice messages coming through from people, so thank you for those. And if anyone does have questions, do add those, but obviously it's also lovely to just hear that you're enjoying the talks, so thank you for that. Okay, someone else has asked, how does one go into the role of being a curator? So this is something I can talk about for far too long, so I'll try and distill it down. A museum work, it's a fantastic, fantastic job to have. And for me, particularly creating exhibitions, doing the research into the prints themselves, but also then thinking about how you could put that together, how you can frame that for different audiences is really what I enjoy the most. So the route I took was a mixture of volunteering, entry-level jobs, documentation roles, and then sort of returning to university in between. So my undergraduate was in archaeology. I then worked in Bristol Museum. I then went back to university to do museum studies, and then back into the museum world, and then back for my PhD. So it's kind of a mixture of an academic role, but also that practical experience of working in museums is really critical. But there's also a lot of different professions around me. So as well as curators, you have conservators, you have digital photographers, you have people organizing events, membership programs. So there's a whole range of careers in museums. So if anyone is interested, then please do follow up those interests, because it's a really rewarding place to be. And some more nice comments. I thank you all for all of those, and I do hope that you will come in and see these prints. Obviously, if you can't come in, we do have the exhibition online. We will be keeping that online for as long as possible after the physical exhibition closes, and that's one of the advantages of this digital age. But as a curator, I do have to say, if you can see these prints in the flesh, please do, because that way you will truly be able to find your own favorites. You will truly find something that really appeals to you, and you'll catch something you might never notice otherwise. And that's why I enjoy doing this job so much. and something I hope you all will have an opportunity to do as well. So I think I will finish there. Thank you all, and we hope to see you again at next week's talk. Thank you.